Welcome to Hope Church Adult Ed, where Jane Schuyler has asked me to tell you that we don't have the automatic captioning working this morning, but then as I'm one of the people that uses it, I'll try to understand my own words. I do speak rapidly and I have a lot of information to present, so I hope you can stay with me. And thank you for coming. This is a really, really important topic in an age of misinformation, and it's important because democracy depends on an informed public, on people making decisions that are in their interest. It's also important for us as people of faith because truth matters. Jesus in his great commandment called for us to love our Lord God with all our heart and also with all our mind. St. Paul warned that there was a time coming, and I wonder if the time is now, when people would not be worshiping God with their mind, a time when people will turn away from listening to the truth and wandering away to myths. And if you look at the evidence of what sales on the internet, we have massive evidence that lies travel much faster than truths across the internet. Jonathan Swift, the satirist, had the idea 300 years ago. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. On Facebook, misinformation gets 6 times as many clicks and passes along as true information. And in the news media, negativity captures our attention and drives online news consumption. Across 105,000 news stories in one recent analysis, each additional negative headline word drove additional clicks. I've shared with you a little essay I've just drafted and that Kathy Brownson has helped me edit on our natural proclivity to negative information and how this affects our politics and even our everyday lives. And so a year ago, the Nobel Prize International Summit focused on how we can combat misinformation. It's a worldwide problem. And what we're going to do today is a little overview, is take a look first, and this is kind of the heart of my presentation, at 10 what strike me as striking examples of massive numbers of people believing things that are demonstrably untrue. Some of these, by the way, will be politically sensitive examples, and so I just want to say in advance, bear with me. They come from both sides of the political spectrum. We're talking about human phenomena here, not one that's owned by any party, although I'm not trying to proclaim a false equivalence. And then I'll offer you some psychological explanations, some principles that help us understand the massive amount of information that's abundant in our culture. And more briefly, some antidotes. So, here we go. Example number 1 pertains to people's fears of COVID during the epidemic. And it turns out, and weirdly so, vaccinated and protected folks have feared COVID more than unvaccinated and unprotected folks. In the early stages of the epidemic, unvaccinated people were many times, 78 times more likely to die of COVID than were vaccinated people. And yet, the more protected people were, the less protected they felt. The Surgeon General commented that vaccinated people overestimate their peril just as unvaccinated people underestimate it. And so in one national survey, in the early stages of the epidemic, 72% of fully vaccinated people were really afraid of COVID, as were only 48% of unvaccinated people and anti-vax people. And Francis Collins recently noted that among those unvaccinated people, 234,000 people died who would not have died had they accepted the vaccine science and taken the vaccine. The second kind of weird finding is that younger adults have feared COVID as much as older adults. Older adults are the ones that were killed by COVID, almost entirely. Younger adults are relatively invulnerable to it. In the first year and a half of COVID, there were 1,600 Americans under age 25 who died of COVID. That sounds like a lot, but as one public health expert has said, that's about what you'd expect from just normal seasonal flu, of which young adults are not afraid. I did a little back-of-the-envelope calculation of the number of vehicle deaths during that same time period to people under 25, and it was approximately 10,000. And then the government actually later did that analysis and found that the number of COVID deaths relative to vehicle deaths for people ages 15 to 24 was 0.11. That is, younger adults and late teens were 1/9 as likely to be killed by COVID as by a car accident. So, however afraid a young adult was of getting in their car and being in a lethal accident, they should have been 1/9 as afraid of COVID. And yet, worldwide, 18 to 29-year-olds were just as likely as 65 and older adults to fear COVID. We were fearing the wrong things, and that's just one example among many of human beings having their fears misaligned with the facts. My favorite example of this, though, is people's fears of flying. There was a Gallup poll a few years back that found that only 40% of people fly without fear. And just yesterday, while on the exercise cycle, I noticed this Yahoo article on how you can mentally prepare yourself for the anxiety of flight and being up in the plane. And yet the simple facts are that mile per mile, we're 1,000 times safer on an airplane than we are in a car. In the last 25 years, nearly 400,000 people have died on America's highways. Only 81 have died on commercial flights. More people have died on passenger trains. If you're going to New York, you're safer with Delta than you are with Amtrak. When I flew to Seattle a week and a half ago, I know these numbers, and they affect the way I feel because I'm a data geek guy. I know that the most dangerous part of my journey is the drive to the Grand Rapids Airport. Once I'm in the loving care of Delta Airlines, I truly relax. I know I'm safe. We're good from that point forward. Knowing these facts, after 9/11, I authored a little essay that was in the Association for Psychological Science news magazine, predicting that given that Americans were now afraid of flying and flying less and driving more, like driving to Florida for spring break instead of flying because flying is dangerous. If we now drive half those unflown miles that we weren't taking on airlines, then we could project, and this was my back of the envelope calculation, that about 800 additional people would die on America's highways in the next year because of their fear of flying. I was stupid enough not to think that a couple of years later I could check that prediction, but a German researcher did and published these data. Here is the month-by-month number of auto fatalities in the United States in the 5 years before 9/11. And as you can see, about 3,000 people a month die on America's highways, slightly more in the fall. Now here's 2001. And you can see that number tracks right on, except you get right to the end, and there were 353 excess deaths on America's highways in the last 3 months after 9/11. And in the ensuing year, there was an additional 1,500. I had projected 800. There was actually 1,500. So think about this. The terrorists, the 9/11 terrorists, indirectly on America's highways killed 6 times as many people as died on those 4 ill-fated flights because we fear the wrong things. And what about crime? And again, the perceptions I'm talking about affect everybody. This is not just a partisan phenomenon. It feels like crime is rising. People are afraid of crime. They're afraid of the streets. Gallup each year for the last how many years has asked people, is there more crime in your area now than there was a year ago, or in the United States than there was a year ago? Every year, 7 in 10 Americans say, yes, there's more crime this year than there was last year. Last year, they said there was more crime then than there was the year before. So we see crime is rising, and politicians amplify this. The murder rate's the highest it's been in 47 years, said President Trump. More recently, we have blood, death, and suffering on a scale once unthinkable. And that's a message that, as we'll see in a moment, we hear repeated in this election season. Meanwhile, these are the data. This is the violent crime rate as aggregated by the FBI from local law enforcement agencies. And as you can see, that's also the property crime rate. We're the safest we've been in decades. Crime hasn't, in certainly your recent memory, been anywhere close to as low as what it is right now. Can we trust these data? We have independent confirmation from the national surveys of crime victimization done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, asking people randomly sampled around America, have you been victimized by a violent crime or by property crime? And as you can see, all the evidence is that this is really a safe time. New York City is a very safe city in which to live right now, despite people's perceptions otherwise. There seems to be a kind of general surmise, by the way, and we'll see this with some other data too, that where I live is great. My town, my neighborhood are safe, healthy places. But the rest of America, the cognitively available America I see on TV and I hear about, it's scary. It's a dangerous place out there. And this applies, by the way, to our perceptions of immigrants. And here, one of my partisan examples, but I'll have them on the other side as well. President Trump, as you know, has told us that when Mexico sends its people, they're bringing drugs and crime, they're rapists, they're coming from jails, they're coming from prisons, we're being overrun by crime. And we have lots of vivid examples of this, of a young woman who was murdered by an undocumented Venezuelan immigrant. And people, as a result of these vivid examples, see, not just Republicans, but the population in general. 57% of Americans say the large number of migrants seeking to enter the US is leading to more crime. Is it true that immigrants are often criminals? The conservative Wall Street Journal says that's a myth. The conservative Cato Institute says that, with few exceptions, immigrants are less crime-prone than native-born Americans. And these are some of the data that Cato, for example, offers. The incarceration rate of undocumented immigrants compared to native-born Americans, the blue bar on your right. The nonpartisan Stanford Economic Policy Research Institute recently took a fresh look at this and said the likelihood of an immigrant being incarcerated is 60% lower than of people born in the United States. And also that the most recent crime data shows crime dropping in cities that have received the most immigrants. By the way, another curious phenomenon is that the fewer immigrants there are in a place where people live, the more afraid of immigrants people are. So West Virginia has the lowest proportion of undocumented immigrants and the highest animosity towards and fear of undocumented immigrants. And yet we see in this political season, former President Trump a month ago tweeting this image of undocumented immigrants coming to get you. 2 weeks ago, he said in Michigan, they're going to walk into your kitchen, they'll cut your throat. A week ago in Wisconsin, this invasion of savage criminals, of murderers, child predators, drug dealers, gang members, thugs, and just last Monday, he told us it's in their genes. And on Friday, he said they're animals, these immigrants. Meanwhile, our Old Testament ethic asks us to remember that the immigrant, the alien who resides with you, shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself. And I'm so proud that Hope Church has done this on a few occasions and has plans with another Afghan family that has connections to the American military moving in and supporting them. Now, I hasten to add that this misinformation and political bias is not just true of one side of the political spectrum. A recent meta-analysis by University of California at Irvine Group found that the biases we're going to be talking about operate in both liberals and conservatives, and it's a human phenomenon. We see it at nearly identical levels. So I've given you examples here of horrific things happening, of immigrants committing terrible crime, and then people overgeneralizing to the immigrant population at large. But this happens from the other end of the political spectrum as well. So the question was asked in a national survey, how many unarmed black men were killed by police in 2021? This was asked in 2022. Among very liberal folks, as you can see, a little more than 4 in 10 estimated about 100, and what's the gray bar number? 28% said about 1,000. Among very conservative people, the most popular response was the blue bar, which is about 10. And the truth was that 11. So here the conservatives were right. And it's the same phenomenon. Images of George Floyd being horrifically killed touches our hearts. It's a vivid image. We remember it. And then we overgeneralize from that how often police are committing such acts. Example number 5 are people's beliefs about the economy. And again, we get examples from both sides of the political spectrum here. Has unemployment gotten worse? 67% of those who voted for Donald Trump just before the election said that unemployment increased during the Obama administration. This is what happened to unemployment during the Obama administration. And it wasn't just Republicans who thought that. Asked more recently, when it comes to the US economy over the last 12 months, do you think the country has been experiencing more job growth than usual? This question was asked in February of 22. 19% of Americans of both parties thought that we were experiencing pretty good job growth, more than usual. Here's the job growth we were experiencing during the 12-month period that was spoken of. More jobs were created in 1 year than ever before in the history of America, and yet only 19% of people understood that truth. 80%, if you will, were living with misinformation. And a national survey found that the unemployment rate, at the time it had fallen to 3.8%, close to a 50-year low, and yet 51% of Americans wrongly believed that unemployment was nearing a 50-year high. This is radical misinformation. This is, most or certainly many people in the voting public believing things that are not true. This, by the way, was what was happening to the unemployment rate during that time period. And what about the inflation rate? You can see in March of 23, it was 5%. Since then, it's come down. We're now approaching 2.3%. But in 2024, 72% said inflation was increasing, when in fact inflation was going down. And again, this is across the political spectrum. The inflation rate for most products has increased over the past 12 months. Most people agree, blues as well as reds. This past February, the Federal Reserve reported that for November 2023, the average person in America perceived inflation to have been 6.4% over the last year, when in fact it was 3.1%. And what about the economy as a whole? 51% rated it as poor. 57% agreed that over the past 2 years, the economy has gotten worse. But yet, if you ask people about their own finances, oh, I'm doing okay. And why not? I mean, unemployment is at a near record low. Inflation's down to under 3%. The gross domestic product, which is the nation's output of goods and services, is at a record high. The stock market is at a record high. Check our retirement accounts. They've never been higher. Things are good for me and for you. But what about for the nation? Well, the national economy, only 18% of Americans think it's doing okay. It's good or excellent. America's falling apart. It's disintegrating. These are the worst of times, Americans think. But again, let's take an example from the other side of the political spectrum. Did inflation rise or fall during the Reagan presidency? At the end of the Reagan presidency, only 8% of Democrats thought that inflation had come down, when in fact it had come down dramatically. And this is what happened to the inflation during the Reagan years. How could Democrats who've lived through the Reagan years not have seen what they'd experienced, which is the decline in inflation? But again, we tend to see the world through a partisan lens. Okay, we're halfway through. Here are examples. What about the percentage of Americans that identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender? Republicans estimate that that's 32% of the population. That's 32% of Democrats, whereas in fact it's only 6%. But then again, to turn this around, Democrats think that 38% of Republicans earn over $250,000 a year, when in reality it's just 2%. And what about that national percentage? Gallup, surveying the nation, finds that a little under 6% of Americans will profess an LGBT identity. but that the average American guesses that 24% of Americans are gay or lesbian. Again, we are radically misinformed. And what about our beliefs about different science-related phenomena? For example, is eating genetically modified foods safe? Yes, say 37% of adults and 88% of American Association for the Advancement of Science members. And in fact, data show that the less you know about GMOs, the more opposed you are to them. The more informed you are about the science, the less worried you are about GMOs. Or what about climate change? Is it mostly due to human activity? 97% of climate scientists assure us that it is. 50% of adults recently doubted that. We hear that climate change is a hoax. I can say that is misinformation. Again, to pick another example, this one that will be a little more warm in the hearts of conservatives here, where I totally appreciate the point. Does marriage matter? Is marriage a good thing? Well, we have lots of data, and this is where I've spilled a lot of ink, showing, for example, that 40% of married adults describe themselves as very happy, as do 23% of never married adults. Or how do children fare as a function of whether they are co-parented or whether they are raised in alternative homes? As you can see from the figure on the right, children thrive with a very low percentage of emotional or behavioral problems in the National Child Health Survey if they're co-parented. By the way, these data control for parental race, income, and education. So holding those things constant, we see that the home structure matters. Co-parenting is a good thing. And yet, if you ask high school seniors, will most people have a fuller and happier life if they choose legal marriage? Less than 40% say yes. In a survey of Americans, 46% say people are just as well off if they decide long-term not to marry. So we're underappreciative of the benefits of a healthy marriage. Certainly not all marriages are healthy, but by and large, covenant partnership and the support that entails for one another and for one's children is a good thing. Next thing, what about the 2020 election? 78% of those who voted for Donald Trump say that it was a rigged election. We've heard that massive numbers of dead people voted. We've also heard, well, the courts have not found evidence of that. It's a big lie. That's a little bit of a weak statement. There's actually some stronger evidence that's pertinent. First of all, did massive numbers of dead people vote? Our Secretary of State said there wasn't a single confirmed case in the state. But okay, she's a Democrat, so why believe her? I mean, if you're believing the conspiracy theory. But think about it. The voter names and addresses of people are public. They're available for checking. If anybody thinks dead people voted, all they need to do is walk straight across the street to the city clerk's office, collect the names, cross-check those with the death records, and find us the dead people. They're not there. Nobody has found them. But it's the easiest thing to discover if it's true. Also consider this. The voting shift from 2016 to 2020 didn't happen just a few places, like Detroit in this state. It was distributed across states and across 175,000 voting precincts in the United States. Democrats gained in nearly every battleground place. So let's just take a look here at our local situation. From 2016 to 2020, the Democratic presidential candidate vote proportion grew from 31 to 38%. In a Republican county with a Republican, what do we call our records clerk, gathering the data. Neighboring Allegan County, the Democratic share went from 32 to 36%. Kent County went from 45 to 52%. So hold it. Think about it. If there was a conspiracy, it had to cross all these Republican venues as well as Democratic venues, all states, 175,000 precincts. Think of the number of tens of thousands of people that had to conspire in order to pull that off without any disclosure of that information. Does that make any credible sense? And also consider, finally, the really interesting question to me is not why did Donald Trump lose, but why did he almost win? Because in the average pre-election poll, Joe Biden was leading him by 7.9%. And on election day, he only won by 4.1% nationally. If the polls are off by that much in that direction in this election, Donald Trump will be the 47th president of the United States. And the question is, why did that happen? Why did the Republicans outperform rather than underperform? Finally, my last example is it really true that the world is getting worse? As you'll see, most people believe. For example, 87% of humans believe global poverty has either stayed the same or gotten worse over the last 2 decades. While that's the percentage of people living in extreme poverty, it's plummeted over the last, 3 decades here, from about 37% down to about 10 or 12%. Meanwhile, the child mortality rate everywhere in the world has come down, and almost all things that you can think of that are bad have been decreasing. Legal slavery in the upper right pink here, world hunger in the lower left, HIV infections. If it's a bad thing, it's been coming down. The world is getting a better place. If it's a good thing, upper right, the agricultural harvest per area, mobile phone penetration, people's human rights to vote and so forth, the world is a better place today than it was back in certainly several decades ago. And look at the United States. Here's what's happened to our personal inflation-adjusted average disposable income. It's almost tripled. And as a result of that, we have twice as many cars per capita today as we did a half century ago. We're eating out 2.5 times as often. We have home air conditioning, which most of us didn't grow up with. We have dishwashers, which most of us didn't grow up with. We have color televisions, which many of us didn't grow up with or even know would exist. We have washing machines. The percentage of family income that we have to spend on food over the last century has plummeted from 44% to 9%. I mean, thank you, Jesus, that I can be alive today rather than 50 or 100 years ago. This is a great time. And yet, when Americans are asked, is life for people like them better or worse than it was 50 years ago? 58% of Americans say life is worse today than it was 50 years ago. Whoa, we are acutely sensitive to negative information. And our kind of radar for negativity is the subject of a little essay that was distributed. So there you have it. Those are 10 examples of what seemed to me to be socially significant, rampant, pervasive misinformation, massive numbers of people believing things that are simply not true. And so I think again of St. Paul's word, is this indeed a time when people will turn away from listening to the truth and wander away to myths? And it's important because democracy depends on an informed public. If you're an incumbent, you will want your people to think that these are good times, continue them with me. If you're a challenger wanting the office, you'll say, our county, our country, or whatever is in decline, we're failing, elect me and I will make things better, I will fix it. So we've seen some striking examples of misinformation. Now let me offer you some psychological science insights into this. First of all, I haven't really talked about this, but some of what we're getting is plain not misinformation, however unintentionally is communicated, but it's plain lies. It's disinformation. It's fake news. And now with the advent of AI, we can't be sure that the video we're seeing is a real video. It's lies in the guise of news. Some of it is just satire that people haven't understood as satire, and it goes viral. Like Trump sends January 6th committee a note from his podiatrist, or Pelosi says she will skip Trump and negotiate directly with Putin, or the CDC quietly admits vaccines do cause antibodies. There's also a certain truth bias that comes built into our human nature. It's a disposition to believe others. And why not? I mean, most people are truth tellers. They do give us valuable information. If they give us directions, we believe them. And so it's appropriate that we normally believe what people tell us. Although it is also true, as my favorite detective, Miss Marple, has said, people are apt to be a little bit too trusting of that information they hear from others. What I want to share with you now is some insights into the power of repetition, a little thinking heuristic that is very powerful in shaping your and my attitudes and feelings, called the availability heuristic, and more briefly, a little evidence about the confirmation bias, group polarization, and how difficult it is to unbelieve something once you've come to believe it. So first, the power of repetition. And we've seen it over and over again. Vaccines cause autism. Climate change is a hoax. The 2020 election stole it. Muslim terrorism is a grave threat. By the way, in response to the latter thing, this was particularly when we were kind of panicked out about Muslim terrorism, somebody did an analysis and found that at that time in 2017, there had been, since 9/11, 230,000 murders in the United States, almost none of which were by Muslim terrorists, which caused somebody to note that toddlers killed more Americans than terrorists in 2015. Snopes checked that out and found it was true. And so somebody simplified that finding to a toddler has shot a person every week in the U.S. for 2 straight years, to which somebody else responded, whoever this toddler is, they must be stopped. So what is it about repetition? Repetition makes statements, whether true or false, first of all, just easier to process. There's a fluency effect. They come to feel familiar, and what's familiar and what slides off the tongue easily feels as more true. And if you've heard something repeatedly over and over again, it comes to be remembered. I mean, it kind of sticks to the mind like peanut butter. And great persuaders have known this. Adolf Hitler wrote, "All effective propaganda must be limited to a very few points and must harp on these in slogans." And so slogans it was for George Orwell's 1984. Freedom is slavery, war is peace. The slogans were repeated over and over again as part of the political education of the people. Back to the Nazis, the great Nazi propaganda said, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. Donald Trump has said the same thing. If you say it enough and keep saying it, they'll start to believe you. And so he has these repeated phrases that he echoes over and again. And one of his supporters, Rich Lowry, noted recently that one of Donald Trump's talents as a communicator is sheer repetition, which attains a certain power. But again, to be bipartisan about this, the Democrats know this too. And Hakeem Jeffries, the House Democratic leader, has told his compatriots to repeat key words, repetition, repetition, repetition. My late Nobel Prize-winning colleague Daniel Kahneman, in Thinking Fast and Slow, noted that a reliable way to make people believe in falsehoods is frequent repetition, because familiarity is not easily distinguished from truth. What's familiar comes to seem as true. Authoritarian institutions and marketers have always known this to be true. And it's true even to a rather ridiculous extreme. Repetition increases the perceived truth of even statements that are highly implausible, like elephants run faster than cheetahs. Now, you know that's false, but if you hear it again and again and again, you still think it's false, but you're not quite so sure. Maybe you're, instead of 98% sure that it's false, you're now 93% or 87% sure that it's false. So, repetition is a powerful, powerful psychological tool. But so is the availability heuristic. Heuristic refers to a kind of cognitive rule of thumb, a basis for making snap intuitive judgments. And one of the most powerful of those heuristics is the availability heuristic, which is our tendency to judge the likelihood of something by the ease with which instances of it come to mind. That is, if examples of something you're worried about or maybe fearing are readily available in your memory, you're more likely to think about that and to judge reality from that. And that's why to a large extent, we intuitively fear the wrong things. And so, for example, we fear, after 9/11, we feared flying, because that's what our ancestral history has prepared us to fear. Enclosed spaces, heights, we fear what we can't control. And if I'm in seat 17B on Delta, I'm not in charge. I'm just, whereas if you're behind the wheel of an automobile, you feel in control, even if you're vastly, 1,000 times more at risk. And we fear what's most readily available in memory. And so images of plane crashes are horrific, vivid events that we can easily call to mind. And of course, the news motto is, we don't cover the planes that land, we only cover the planes that don't land. And thus gives us images of that. And for that reason, our feelings and our intuitions more easily hijack our thinking than does our thinking rule our feelings. So I had one person I was close to who was petrified of flying. I gave her the data, but the data aren't sufficient to overwhelm, I mean, they are for me, but not for a lot of people to overwhelm feelings. And that's because images are so powerful. Images capture our attention. They're easily remembered and thus available in memory. They touch our hearts, our emotions, and they affect our judgments of reality. And just to give you another example of the power of the availability heuristic, think about our fear of guns in schools and of children being slaughtered in horrific incidents such as Parkland, following which a majority of U.S. teens report now fearing a shooting could happen at their school. Most parents share their concern about school shootings. Most teachers in America are at least somewhat afraid that a school shooting might occur there. Schools are holding lockdown drills. We're spending billions of dollars to hire security personnel and to institute savings, secure protections at our school. Parents nationwide are wrestling with their fear of school shooting. Every time a new school shooting grips the country, parents contend with a renewed sense of foreboding about sending their children to school. We're doing lockdown drills where we have kids rehearsing being the victim of a school shooter. And yet the statistical fact are, school shootings happen, they're horrific events, but folks, from Anchorage to Miami, we got a lot of schools. And more children have died from lightning strikes than from mass shootings in schools in the last 20 years. A Harvard risk expert notes that the 1 in 614 million odds of a child's being shot and killed at school on any given day are far lower than almost any other mortality risk a child faces, including traveling to and from school in a car, or playing sports, or guns in the home, or guns in the neighborhood. Those are the much bigger threats. My Harvard colleague, Steve Pinker, asked, what is the one thing wrong with the world that you would change and why? He said, the thing that's most wrong is people's thinking and assessing the world through anecdotes and images rather than data and facts. And so as an educator and somebody who has the privilege of, through textbooks, talking to a large number of students, we say, let's teach it. The plural of anecdote is not data. Well, although in a sense it is, now that I say that, because what is data? I mean, I believe it. Real people's life stories and experiences that touch my heart, not in data and statistics. But what are data and statistics? But many people's stories. If one person's story is important, then isn't everybody's personal story important? And what the national data are giving us is everybody's stories. And so let's not trivialize that. Okay. Next principle, I want to introduce before I name it by just telling you about a little demonstration that I've done many times in class, and it always works beautifully. I tell students I have in mind a simple rule that is illustrated in a series of 3 numbers, 2, 4, 6. Now your task, and you can imagine being one of my students here, is to guess what the rule is that those 3 numbers illustrate. And then to test your guess, don't just believe it, but test it by writing additional 3-number sequences, and I'll come around and look at them and indicate whether your sequence of numbers do or don't illustrate the rule. And then keep doing this until you're confident. Keep testing it until you're confident you know the rule. Most students, when going through this exercise, will become absolutely confident of a wrong rule. They'll think, for example, that the rule is maybe counting by twos. So then they'll give me 8, 10, 12. I'll say, yep, that illustrates it. Then they'll give me 49, 51, 53. I'll say, yes, that's it. But what they're doing is seeking to confirm what they already believe. And this is called confirmation bias. In this case, my rule was any three ascending numbers. So if you gave me 4, 7, 1,000, I mean, that would illustrate the rule as well. But the only way you find it is if you actively try to disconfirm, to disprove what you believe, rather than simply find more confirming evidence for what you already believe. But in fact, most of us are prone to confirmation bias. We seek information that confirms and that illustrates what we already believe. And we prefer that over inconvenient truths, if you will. T.S. Eliot had the idea a half century ago, we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started, thanks to confirmation bias. More briefly, I cut my eye teeth in social psychology doing research on a phenomenon called group polarization. If you group like-minded people together who are on opposite sides of an issue, and the people on the other side group with their own kind, and you have them discuss that issue, they tend to grow further apart. They polarize, and we call this group polarization. In our best-known experiment, we illustrated this by grouping together high or low prejudice high school seniors to discuss some racial situations. And as you can see, after discussion, they were more polarized than they were before. Little did I expect when I initially doing this research that modern technology would put this phenomenon on steroids. Now we have cable channels to our own liking. We don't all get our news from Walter Cronkite. We have the internet, which allows us to find our own kind in social media. And sure enough, blues are mostly interacting with other blues, reds mostly interacting with other reds, and so group polarization has, if you will, been put on steroids. And what is the result? The result has been, over time, a deep animosity towards those of the other party. And this is, again, bipartisan. Republicans hate Democrats more than ever. Democrats hate Republicans more than ever. Perhaps it's true for you as for so many. In this upcoming presidential election, you're for one candidate, but you're even more against the other candidate than you are for yours. And indeed, people on both parties see the other party as dishonest, closed-minded, immoral, and so forth. So to recap, we live in a post-truth world where opinions are trumping facts, where people have their own alternative truths, if you will. Why is this happening? It's because, in part, a natural disposition to believe what others say, because of the power of repetition, because of the incredible power of the availability heuristic, because of our use of confirmation bias and our own information processing, and because of group polarization. And it's sustained by a little phenomenon we call belief perseverance. It's hard to unbelieve. And this is demonstrated in some recent research in which people are given information about something that they don't really know anything about. And they find that it's easier to persuade somebody to believe something than, once you've persuaded them, to get them to let go of the belief that they've embraced. So, for example, they told people either that Michelangelo's statue of David is in Venice or that it's in Florence. Once you're persuaded that it's in one of those two places, say that it's in Venice, it's very hard to get you then to let go of that belief and believe that it's in Florence, which is where it really is. By the way, I had to look that up, so if you didn't know that. And we see this operating in real life. For example, during the Iraq War, as it was being launched, Americans overwhelmingly supported the Iraq War only on the condition that, as we were promised, Saddam Hussein was harboring weapons of mass destruction. If he didn't have those weapons of mass destruction, then the purpose for the war was ill-founded and we were against it. Okay, we went to war. What do you know? There were no weapons of mass destruction. So the basis for the war was ill-founded. But when now resurveyed after the war, most Americans still supported the war. Now they invented new reasons. Well, Saddam Hussein was evil and it was very good to get rid of this evil person. So as Benjamin Franklin noted some years ago, people are much more easily deceived than undeceived. And thus it is that in this corner, still undefeated, are Frank's long-held beliefs. So just to close out here, what are the antidotes? Partly, they're the process of science. What do we want? We want evidence-based science. When do we want it? After peer review. That's what people like my former student who's with us here today, Sharon Carnahan, and I say. Let me just give you an example of how this process works and how it's worked to change what I believe about something, and why I'm going to suggest to Sharon Carnahan and Jane Dickey it should change what they believe about seasonal affective disorder, wintertime depression. People are more vulnerable to depression in the darkness of winter. You know that. It's part of the American Psychiatric Association's DSM. There was a very careful analysis published recently of 35,000, more than 34,000 people responding to a CDC survey and ascertaining, is depression in fact more common around the winter solstice? Is it more common for those who live in cloudy areas like West Michigan than in San Diego? Is it more common on cloudy days than on sunny days? Is it more common in higher latitudes with less winter sun? Are people in northern Norway more depressed in the winter than people living nearer the equator? The answer to all those questions is no. There's just no evidence that, in fact, despite people do become depressed in winter. They become depressed in summer too, but if they become in winter, they attribute it to the weather and the limited daylight. Hold it. I've been teaching about seasonal affective disorder. This can't be true. So I checked it myself. I went to Google Trends. You can check the occurrence of words across the time. So I asked for this, I did this recently. How often do people search for basketball as a function of different months of the year? As you can see, it peaks in March, just as you'd expect. What about flu? That peaks in wintertime, people search. What about depression or sad? There's just no change in people's search for those words across the 12 months of the year on Google. So I say, with Ms. Marple, again, it wasn't what I expected, but facts are facts, and if one is proved to be wrong, one must just be humble about it and start again. And that leads to, and more briefly and in closing, the importance of education, both for providing accurate information that debunks untruths, and that, as we now say, pre-bunks them, that anticipates people's exposure to misinformation and inoculates them against that. And across the educated political spectrum, we now have evidence that educated people, college-educated people in particular, are much better at evaluating evidence, and thus educators really need to focus increasing scientific literacy and critical thinking. And it does predict decreased belief in conspiracy theories. If you're scientifically literate, you are less likely to believe in conspiracy theories. And so we teach a scientific attitude that is a spirit of curiosity about the world, not of cynicism, but of skepticism that asks, what do you mean? How do you know? And that it conveys an attitude of humility and openness to new ideas and to the possibility that one might be wrong. And that's so essential to the spirit of liberty, the spirit that is not too sure that it's right. And it turns out that that's also at the very heart of our reformed and ever-reforming religious tradition. If you're a theist, you believe two things. Number one, there is a God. Number two, it's not you, and it's not me. We are fallible. We are finite creatures, and thus we should hold our own untested beliefs lightly. I love the reformed and ever-reforming tradition, which has been foundational to the establishment of universities and the birth of science itself, and is played out in my own institution with its strength in the sciences. And we should assess others' beliefs with open-minded skepticism. And when appropriate, we should use observation and experimentation to winnow error from truth. And that's also the lesson in the psalm that is part of this week's lectionary, that will be in this service perhaps. So teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts to wisdom. And don't we need that now? So there you have it, and that leaves us 10 minutes for some So I welcome your questions, challenges, or additional examples of what has struck you as misinformation. And my favorite skeptic, Tim Pennings, is going to start us off.
Well, my first question is, do you have any information on education? Because one place where I do seem to hear constantly that the world is going in the wrong direction is when you talk to teachers who have been teaching for K-12 for 30, 40 years, and when they talk about the number of students coming in who need food, who are hungry, who misbehave, who have learning disorders, ADHD, those kinds of things, it seems to be a different world than it was a couple generations ago. Any information on that?
I don't have information on the frequency with which those things are true. But as this little essay will suggest to you, I think that probably you could go back 10 years, 20 years, 30 years and find people saying exactly the same thing. Because we're always attuned to negative examples and to students that come in unprepared and so forth. I will say post-COVID, students who had been kind of quarantined and now we're getting back to social engagement and so forth, that was a real issue. It's also a real issue today that students are so wedded to smartphones and social media and spend so many hours on that. And that has implications for their being well slept, for their social relationships, and they're having time to do the math reading and problem solving that you want. So those are real things. Yeah, Larry, or Cindy.
Thanks, David. And keeping in mind you're quite the optimist in a lot of things, which may bias some of the stats that you presented, perhaps, just looking at the larger data here, knowing you a little bit. Just a couple of pushbacks. One was it was right to fear COVID, if I may say that, and the information given to different communities varied differently. There was, my anecdotal experience was we had a lot of Hispanic, Latino young deaths in West Michigan. So I don't know how widely based your information was, but anecdotally, this is what we saw in the ICUs, is a disproportionate number of young Latino deaths. You can push back with other stats if you want on that, but I think it was right to fear COVID, especially when we didn't have a lot of information early on, which may also pertain to the fear of flying. I wasn't afraid of flying, I was afraid of catching COVID on a flight, which I think I actually contracted COVID on a train a year ago. Thanks a lot to, that wasn't Amtrak either, so. And then one more thing about the economics thing. I think Heather Cox Richardson had her post the other day talking about the disparity of perception that Republicans tend to do better with the economy than Democrats. That's the perception, but she cited a whole bunch of stats that shows a Democratic president leads to better economics.
So let me just stick with the COVID one if I could. First of all, COVID definitely was worth, it's not a microphone, I guess. COVID was definitely worth fearing. It killed 1.2 million Americans. It's killed millions of people more worldwide. My point is not that we shouldn't have feared COVID. We absolutely should have feared COVID. But number one, that the people that should have been most afraid were not most afraid. Older people should have feared it more than younger people. And you can have some examples of young Latinos dying of COVID. 1,600 young people did die nationwide of COVID, but many more died in auto accidents, and just as many died of seasonal flu. And so, I mean, those are the data that I would hang my hat on. Can't remember what, I want to leave the last one alone, but anyway, so I'll just leave it there.
Hi, Dave, thank you. First of all, you changed my life at Hope College, and now...
I hope it's for the better.
For the better, and now you're still doing it more than 10 years later. 10 years? And Sue and I don't even want to know what age that makes you, because...
Right.
But
by the way, I tell people I'm 82, but I'm not as old as I look. I'm only 82.
Wow. I'm going to start using that.
Yeah.
Okay. So here is my question, and it's a little bit of a pushback too. Miss is kind of the victim. This is what you hear, and this is how you act.
Hold the microphone a little bit
Oh,
closer.
sorry. I worried about not misinformation. When I first read it, I heard and read in my mind disinformation. And what I worry about are not accidental clicks and passing on something. I worry about the deliberate lying that is changing in sort of fundamentally politics. When you talked about language, Frank Luntz in 1984, when he wrote the Republican pollster, when he wrote the 10 points for Newt Gingrich to take over the House of Representatives, he talked about essentially lying, changing our perception. So I'd like to focus on my behavior. I'm going to work at it. But what I really worry about are people who deliberately, repetitively lie and fill us with hatred. That's what I worry about. And the people who support Trump up where our cottages are, they were left behind in a way. And for them, fear is motivating, and they continually hear it they hear hatred. I'm blaming the people that are doing it. That's who I worry about.
Right. So certainly there is disinformation. As a social psychologist, my focus is less on kind of the intentional propaganda of politics than it is on normal everyday misinformation that people absorb and spread. And I can give that talk and be a little less political. Yes. Okay? You're good, Tom.
David, thank you very much for once again, wonderful presentation and really thought-provoking. You had a slide about the well-being of the economic well-being of Americans, and the slide was of the average inflation-adjusted income or something. And I wonder if it might not be much more useful, helpful, to instead of considering the average, to consider the median, because which would give more weight to the people whose inflation-adjusted incomes have actually decreased over the past 40 years.
Right. So that's a good point. So when I give the average disposable income increasing, that includes all income. That's inflated, by the way, or that's increasing partly because of the doubling of married women's employment over that time period. So we have more people generating income. So it's not that real wages have increased that fast. During the first part of that 50-year period, income inequality also increased. So the rising economic tide was lifting the yachts faster than the dinghies, if you will. So that's a good point. I glossed over that. And yet, inequality has not increased recently. And it is true that all Americans' homes now are blessed with more resources, more color televisions and smartphones and dishwashers and air conditioning and so forth than was the case 60 years ago. But it's not been equal. And obviously, at the very high end, we have more such people. So, yes.
Dave, thank you. I'm going to share something that I bite my tongue about, but I try to do it.
Go ahead. We can take it.
This week I'm going to be with a group that we hunt grouse for a weekend, long weekend. And this group, this will be like 25 or 26 years we've been together. And the core group is a bunch of Italians who are in the construction business from the Detroit area. And to say they're conservative is, you need to put a capital C on it. And one of them is a very good friend of mine, and I go visit his house, and he just has Fox News on. That's it. Okay. That's all he watches. And so I said to him one day, I said, Bob, you need to just change the channel every once in a while. And after saying that to him a couple of years, I looked myself in the mirror and I said, well, I need to change the channel too. So I now make an effort to watch Fox News. And I have to say that I'm not converted, but I have, I think, a better appreciation for what motivates people on that side. So. for what it's worth.
Thank you, Ed. Good for you. And by the way, there are efforts to bring people together, just as you and your friend were together this weekend. One national movement is called Braver Angels, and it brings reds and blues together. Before they talk about their specific differences about candidates, compare their underlying values, which often are not as far apart. We got a couple more questions. I want to let Sharon have the last one too. Go ahead.
What is the difference or fine line between gaslighting and lying? Because Trump, back in 2016, I read he was an expert in gaslighting.
I don't have expertise there, but thank you for making the point. You got it here. Thank you. So, again, some things, by the way, when I don't know the answer, I say, that's a very good question. Sharon, our former student, who's just retired from Rollins in Florida and up here visiting.
And I did teach social psych about 12 times.
Okay.
People my age grew up learning to dialogue with African Americans and with people who held strong prejudices against African Americans. That was the issue of my teens and early 20s. This radical political polarization is the issue of today. What are some specific strategies that work in social psychology to help people see each other's point of view, to help people understand each other when they are polarized?
Yeah,
By
so
the way, when you said polarization, my brain said risky shift.
Right.
I want you to know that.
Right. That was the phenomenon from which group polarization grew. So that tells me that Sharon's older than I thought she was. So, I mean, that is sort of the enterprise of the Braver Angels movement, bringing together people. And you have to listen deeply. And you start by, first of all, trying to understand the other rather than try to persuade the other. Listen deeply. Reflect what the other is saying. And let the other reflect what you're saying, so that each of you feels like, yeah, you got it. That's exactly how I feel. And start by assessing your underlying values, your underlying commitments. What deeply matters? In an ideal world, what would that look like? And then you could discuss whether a 20% tariff on incoming goods is a good idea, because now this becomes a specific policy thing in terms of you would increase government revenue, reduce. I mean, you can have all the debate about the pros and cons of that, and you're two rational people who share some underlying values. So that's just very briefly, because our time is up, one thing. So,
Indeed,
Jane,
our
is always
time
the
is
last
up.
word.
Thank you, David, once again.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely fascinating conversation. I want to let you know quickly that next week, you can read on page 13 in your worship bulletin once again, but as we start to enter the season of our budget design for 2025, Bob Leidens will be here to read a chapter from his latest book entitled Keepers, and we're going to talk about what it means to be stewardly caregivers of any and all neighbors in need. And after Bob shares the chapter, Steve Hugerwerf and Scott Rumsa will be here to share some reflections on that as well. And then the conversation will be opened up once again for all to participate in. So looking forward to seeing you next week as well. And sorry, I do apologize for the heat. You've got a lot of warm bodies in here. And so we did ask Bruce to turn down the heat, but maybe it was a little too late. You'd already warmed the room. So we do apologize for the heat today, but we hope you all come back next week. Thank you.